Welcome to issue 36 of Language Testing Bytes. In today's issue, we're going to talk about 4 viewpoints written by Tineke Brunfaut, Dylan Burton, April Ginther, and Lynda Taylor on the 40th anniversary of the Language Testing Journal. A viewpoint is a new article type in the journal. These are 4,000 words commissioned position papers on key topics from authors with invited rejoinders. The aim is to choose timely topics and publish these through an expedited process, ensuring that the journal remains responsive to current issues and debates in the field. While the 4 viewpoints are diverse with regard to their topics and foci, they all offer authors' perspectives on opportunities and challenges for the language testing community on the 40th anniversary of language testing. The 4 viewpoints that we will discuss today are titled Future Challenges and Opportunities in Language Testing and Assessment, Basic Questions and Principles at the Forefront, by Tineke Brunfaut, Reflections on the Past and Future of Language Testing and Assessment, An Emerging Scholar's Perspective by Dylan Burton, Administration, Labor and Love by April Ginther, and Reframing the Discourse and Rhetoric of Language Testing and Assessment for the Public Square by Lynda Taylor. April, Lynda, Tineke, and Dylan, I would like to welcome you to today's issue of Language Testing Bytes, and thank you for agreeing to take part in this interview. As I was preparing for today's interview, I decided to organize our discussion around the following 3 main issues that were raised across multiple viewpoints. These are issues related to the target language use domains and test constructs, issues related to the use of technology in language assessment, and issues related to assessment literacy and research transparency. So let's start with the first issue. As there are myriads of language use domains, how do you think we can we reconcile the need to assess them with practical constraints? Do you think the testing of various language domains is more essential for high-stakes assessment contexts or for low-stakes assessment contexts, for example, for local tests? April, would you like to start?
Thanks, Russ, for inviting us and giving us the opportunity to talk about these issues because they're so interesting. So I've always held the position that tests should serve something. Well, they always serve something. But in my opinion, it's best when they serve an instructional program, because what we want to know is we want to know how students develop over time. And given that we have a reliable and valid scale, when someone takes a test within a program, we can see where they're starting and also where we want them to go at the same time. So having that opportunity to look at student growth within a program allows us to make selections on representation. So what do we want to represent? In a local domain, we can represent anything or what's most important to the student and what's most important to the program, what's most important to the language user. I'm not so interested in making a perfect generic test that works for everyone, because I think we have great opportunities to look at how the construct works and what we can do with it within those local domains. There are practical constraints, but you can do a lot within a local domain because you have so much freedom when you're freed from having to be generic and having to be objective and having to work for everyone. So that's where I think the growth of our understanding of the construct lies. I think we should always consider stakes for the student. And the most important stake for them is that they're able to function within a domain and get what they want and achieve what they value. And that gives us a lot of room to examine the construct beyond just entry-level proficiency, where we tend to focus large industrialized tests. I think within those local domains, we have great opportunities. And that's where the growth in our field, well, a lot of the growth will occur.
Lynda?
Okay, I think I'd echo many of the things that April has said. And, you know, the basic point is that testing is the art of the possible. It's what you can actually manage to do. And that's shaped by all sorts of different considerations, not least the question of resources. But if we're looking at language use domains, then I think those can be defined in a wide variety of ways. So you could talk about educational domains, which I think is very much what April was referring to. You could also talk about professional domains. There's the social domain of language testing when it becomes part of the process for making decisions about people's futures. And all of those are domains that have been changing over time. They are constantly evolving. How we test or how we construct our constructs is also evolving. And in a sense, context and purpose are the dominant features that we need to think about when designing any test. I think increasingly we're aware of the importance of the need for stakeholder collaboration, understanding who the stakeholders are in any testing enterprise, and ensuring that we consult widely, and that it's not just language testing specialists who are engaged in this exercise. And I include learners in that as well, and test takers. The question of high stakes, low stakes, I do agree actually with April that while it's a convenient distinction to make, it's misleading in terms of perhaps privileging one over another. And in fact, there are high stakes associated with almost any test for those who are taking the test and who are being subjected to the use of scores in some way or other. Perhaps local tests are not low stakes tests at all, and sort of professional oriented tests are not necessarily high stakes in the traditional way that we've understood those. In a sense, they are both high and low stakes at one and the same time. And the trick for us is to work out for whom is this a high stakes and for whom might this be low stakes. So I think there are myriads of language use domains. I'm not sure there are any more than there ever used to be. I think they're just changing their shape, and we're having to keep up with that.
Well, just a minute, I want to jump in because I think I agree too with Lynda about stakes. It's not high or low, but I want to say we have rich stakes. We have opportunities for people to do things with tests and examine the construct, and we can represent what we want. We simply have to argue for it and consider its value. And its value to whom? Okay, right. But for me, it always wants to be the learner that we're going to front. Because that's what I think we're interested in as scholars within applied linguistics and linguistics, understanding how language develops over time. Tests give us that opportunity. So the stakes are rich for all of us.
I guess I would just add to that while it is possible to center the learner, there's also the question of language testing within society, of which we are all a part. And it's important to understand how tests are used and abused, misused, used well within a societal framework. And we've got a better handle on that now than we used to have, but there's a long way to go.
Why do you think we're seeing a growing recognition of the need to measure multimodal constructs? Why are these constructs important, and what are the implications of measuring them? Dylan?
Thanks, Russ, and also thanks for inviting me to this talk. I feel a little bit of imposter syndrome amongst all of you guys here, but this is a super interesting question, especially given the previous one when we're talking about domains. Setting up a construct and describing a domain is integral, of course, to creating a test. But when it comes to multimodality, we know that all language use in a variety of domains requires different modes of communication. Communication is inherently multimodal, right? It's not just listening to speech or reading text. We're also drawing on visuals. We're drawing on, of course, body language. We're drawing on space and motion and other sounds. And so we need to include this in our constructs eventually because it's all part of communication. And different domains may require different aspects of communication as well. If we think about this type of Zoom environment that we're in right now, the types of turn taking and the types of different sounds that are happening are quite different than we would experience in a face-to-face scenario. And so it's our job to describe those and begin to understand how they might impact communication and need to be part of the construct.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think why should we integrate multimodal aspects into our constructs? Meaning is not just about conveying or arriving at meaning through language in the narrow sense, purely oral or verbal. And I think now it's particularly timely now because while communication has always had a sort of a visual side to it, I think the extent of the visual aspects have increased so much in a very short period of time, and enabled also through all the technological advances in recent decades. And I think in probably the last 2 or so decades, it's also become much more feasible to assess multimodal constructs. So the availability of software and hardware that can capture or deliver multimodal constructs is just incredible by now. And importantly, also what is available has become so much more user-friendly and so much more freely available and accessible to a whole range of stakeholders. These technological advances do not just offer ways of assessment, but also ways of defining those multimodal constructs better, understanding the constructs better, and also offer ways of evaluating multimodal forms of assessment as well. And I think this also, in general, fits in quite well with developments in broader linguistics and applied linguistics. If we think about sort of what the debates and the research that has been done in recent years in fields like literacy studies and even multimodality and language education, in some ways, we might actually need to admit that in language testing, we are running a little bit behind on these things compared to other areas of applied linguistics. So it just seems the right time, but also important to focus on multimodal constructs in assessments, because it really reflects communication and our communicative reality in the 21st century.
I was just going to add to that there's a reconceptualization going on in linguistics and applied linguistics and language education in relation to multilingualism and translanguaging, which I think for most of us in language testing and assessment hasn't quite touched us yet, but really should do. That's part of the multimodal construct definition and operationalization that I think we're going to have to grapple with over the next period of time. It's happening in 1 or 2 places around the world. South Africa is a good example, but I think in general, I rarely see things in our own conferences which touch upon this important area. And the notion of languages as, solitudes, which I think is sort of in isolation, is beginning to fade.
Yes, and I think, Lynda, you touched also on sort of the implications or the challenges there are for us in aiming to measure multimodal aspects. And I would say, that will require a multitude of things, going from we need to revisit and expand on the construct definitions. We need to explore modes of delivery more, test administration procedures. We need to think about task types that will reflect and elicit multimodal constructs. A particular challenge, I think, will be in rating criteria, rating scales that capture multimodality, and also how raters or even automated systems evaluate performances from those respects. And then how do we interpret the scores? How do we report the scores? How do we validate, evaluate multimodal assessments? So I think there's quite a number of implications and challenges ahead for us. What I would like to add, though, that at least in my view, I don't think this means there is no place at all anymore for so-called more traditional independent skills testing. I think it's about broadening the range of constructs rather than completely shifting the range of constructs. And I also think that there is research and there is expertise and knowledge that already exist in language testing on which we can build to do this. For example, if we look at the work that has already been done in language for specific purposes testing, where they've already grappled with several issues around language and content, for example, or research that has been done on more sort of integrated forms of testing. So we can certainly also make use of the insights we already have in some of those areas and build further on them.
I have one little follow-up. I was thinking just in terms of practice and on the practical level when we consider the use of technology and what it's contributed. When I started, it was just so hard. You had to capture and it was so difficult. And I think about like in 1965, when people had to capture on tape and certain cutoffs that we have when we look at fluency variables that we cut where people could perceive, where they could mark with the magic marker and, so that is really, that's been a good standard, but now it's so much easier with speaking. I mean, and certainly technology has facilitated that. Over the 20 years that I practiced, it became a different world to examine speaking, for example.
Talking about technology, we can move to the next question, which is what issues related to technology use in language assessment do you consider to be the most pressing nowadays and why?
Well, let me say, after the pandemic, there were certain things that I thought that we would never do or could never do. And switching over was just, that pandemic changed our views in so many ways, so many things. We do see that there's, of course, when the big tests are moving to sort of sociolinguistic variables, and, there's good and bad aspects of that focus on essential characteristics of performance, which can be argued what's essential, right? Technology has certainly facilitated that move towards sort of micro variables and variables that are I can't say easily measured, but that psycholinguistic item perspective is growing, and we want to look at it and manage it and understand what the direction the Duolingual and certainly ETS is taking now with the developments of their current entry-level tests that are in themselves a response to the pandemic, right?
I think that's a good point, actually. I think it's early days to be able to evaluate exactly how technology is reshaping language testing and assessment. I think that one of the points that April has raised is this really difficult question about what is it exactly that we're really interested in or is really salient or important, because there are so many features now that can be measured or counted technologically, but are they all of the sort of equivalent important, or do they vary according to level? So there are decisions to be made about what to do with all the data that can be captured and how to interpret it. I think a bigger question for me is the sort of social ethic question, which is the ethics of the use of technology in language assessment, all the way from capturing people's performances and then dissecting them in a way that takes a certain level of ownership over them, when in fact the performance is really theirs, right through to the question of the ethics of remote proctoring and what happens with all the data that's captured in addition to the performance on the individual concern, and what is done with that and who has access to it. And so there are a whole bunch of things from an ethical perspective that I think are going to be seriously challenging over the next few years. And people fortunately have started thinking about these, but technology, in my experience, can run away with us and we run to catch up with it. And it's not always we who are in the driving seat. And that's always a risk. It always has been.
I think in the coming years, we're going to see more and more of what Duolingo is doing and sort of large scale testing, of course, not in local testing or anything, but with automated test generation. Duolingo is already having their items automatically generated. They're, of course, reviewed afterwards by a panel. But this is sort of the initial appearance of this, as far as I know. I know other organizations have experimented with it. But I think we'll see more and more of this for large-scale organizations. It does call into question, what does it mean to have a test that's not created by a human? What does it mean, and what is it measuring? And then on the other side of that is the automated scoring of the tests. I think it will improve in accuracy, but when I think about automated scoring, I wonder if the construct is the same as with human scoring. What is an automated black box taking into account that humans aren't? But that's sort of where I see technology heading.
It actually reminds me of what Tineke mentioned in her viewpoint about the risk of language testing being technology driven rather than technology enhanced. I wonder, Tineke, if you could comment on that a little bit more.
Yeah, so it's something that is on my mind a lot. I mean, not just in technology supported environments, but in general. But I think particularly with the fast movements we see in technology use in language assessment, there is a lot of focus at the moment on things such as convenience, accessibility, test security in the technical sense. And something that is always on my mind is that we shouldn't lose sight of these fundamental questions such as what are we testing, that risk that the technology is starting to drive what it is we are testing rather than the technology enhances us to test what we would like to test or the constructs we are interested in. And so the risk of potentially technology narrowing the constructs we are testing, or that accuracy and reliability start to overtake construct validity. I'm not saying that's necessarily the case, but I think there is a risk and we should be aware of it. And so in a way, I think one of the challenges for the future in this case might also relate to, and I'll go back to the progress that is being made in applied linguistics and linguistics more generally in terms of the descriptions or sort of captures of what is the nature of language used in society. Those broader constructs versus, I think at the moment, the predominant paradigm is still one of a so-called language standard and languages as being separable, whereas in broader applied linguistics, there's the debates around lingua francas, world languages, translanguaging, intercultural communication, and also a lot of the technology focuses on English as a language. So what about all the other languages in the world? And so to me, that's one of the sort of pressing areas for attention for technology enhanced testing as well, that technology also thinks about, or the use of technology that we think about, how can this actually support conceptualizations or our understanding of language and language use much more broadly.
But I wanted to follow up too on this idea of what's possible, what technology makes possible, because maybe you're aware of how now you can retake the TOEFL. You can find out what you got on the first part of the test and then decide, well, if I need this cut score, I'm this far away, so I can retake. And ETS has encouraged that with My Best Scores and inviting people to sign up for the next test, which they can take next week. This is truly problematic. And certainly ETS has published many studies on when it's in their interest to talk about how retaking does not increase your score because the test is so reliable and the standard error of measurement is so low that if you retake it within a week or 2 weeks, nothing's going to change. Okay. And that largely is true, and it's been demonstrated many times. But so what happens ethically when you encourage people to retake the test in the next week? So that marketing decision is, I think, something that's facilitated by technology and by taking tests online and being there in the lab. But so that's real conflict. We want the test to be reliable. We want the test to be stable. We want the scores not to change. But then on the other hand, if we're a commercial enterprise, maybe we want people to take the test over and over again within 3 weeks.
So we'll talk about issues related to assessment literacy and research transparency. How can we as a field frame our discourse about language assessment issues so that it is understandable, accessible, and meaningful to the general public, not just to the peer stakeholders? How can assessment literacy help with this endeavor?
I think, I've written quite a lot about assessment literacy over a number of years. And I think what I've come to realize is that the first stage is a sort of level of self-awareness that we need in our own community about the language that we use when we talk about assessment, and the extent to which it's not a language that's particularly accessible to people who are not in our community, people who are in from other communities, whether it's the teaching profession or whether it's the policy-making community or whether it's the general public or politicians or whoever. So I think what I try to advocate now is a sense of, first of all, self-awareness, and also some degree of humility, that it's not a matter for us to educate other communities, but to engage in conversation with other communities beyond our own community in a language that we can all share. So then it's a question of trying to understand, so what is the nature of the language that communicate? And the irony for me has always been that, as most of us as applied linguists and English language specialists, are supposedly excellent communicators. In reality, I don't think we necessarily do that very well a lot of the time. So we need to work harder at that. So then it becomes a question of finding points of engagement with communities beyond our own, and also choosing a language and a discourse that is going to be accessible, which may mean a less technical language. It may mean not trying to focus on some of the concepts that are important to us, or finding other ways of describing them, words like validity, construct, using metaphors and imagery that are more accessible. And I think this has been done really well in a number of other social science communities, where applied linguists working with corpora, large-scale corpora, have been able to find those points of connection and communication in language with other communities, whether it's healthcare communities or political groups. So I guess what I'm arguing for is self-awareness, humility, and a willingness to reach out, collaborate, engage in research, and be a little bit more communicatively effective in ways that go beyond talking to ourselves, which I think we've done a lot of for far too long.
Could you talk some more about being humble and what you mean by humility in this domain? I think that's really an interesting idea.
I think what I'm trying to say is that we get very frustrated as language testers when policymakers or test score users don't seem to use the tests or the test scores in the ways in which we think they should. And we wonder why it is they don't seem to get it. And I think, and I put myself into this category, I spent a lot of time trying to explain to score users what IELTS scores mean. And then I got frustrated when it turned out that perhaps they didn't seem to understand what I was trying to say. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact I wasn't necessarily using a language that was accessible. Certainly the things we write are far too long. The articles we refer people to, I think, go and look at that validity study. That'll help you. Well, why should they? It's that's what I mean by a certain level of arrogance. And I think the same is true when it comes to what has been referred to sort of language assessment literacy for teachers. And I know Beverly Baker really takes issue, and I agree with her to some extent, with the notion of literacy for language teachers when it comes to assessment. She much prefers, and I would agree with her, the term competence, because it's not a question of being deficient in a sort of illiteracy sense. It's much more a question of having access to the knowledge and skills that are needed for your particular context. And I don't think necessarily as language assessment specialists, we've always been very good at sharing that, except on our own terms. That's what I mean by a need for some level of humility.
Why is research transparency important for advancing our field? What steps can or should we take to promote research transparency in language assessment?
Yeah, essentially, transparency in research in many ways comes down to validation in research methodology, I guess. And that then fundamentally determines the validity of the research findings and the interpretations of the research and the implications. So if we're being transparent, it means there's the possibility to evaluate the quality of the research, to look at the scope of the research, to evaluate the relevance of the produced research across settings, across methods, across contexts. It allows for replication, so we're talking about scaling up, about generalizing findings, and so we can come to a point then that we take a more synthetic approach to the body of research in a field. So it allows us to take stock through systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and so on. And that then in turn again allows us to identify where gaps remain, and allows us to shape the future research agenda and so on. So in that sense, transparency is pretty fundamental to our field. Another angle to it is also about open research, so open source, open access, data repositories, and so on. And some there's obviously many benefits to those. One, I think, quite important one is it makes research much more accessible to scholars who work in resource-low contexts. And secondly, it allows us also to communicate with wider audiences, whether that's scholars in other fields, or practitioners, policymakers, and so on. And so then we're starting to talk about the impact of our research and the possibility of generating impact with our research. But just one thing I would like to add around sort of all these open source initiatives, which I do think are very important, is that I wouldn't like it to become dogmatic either, in the sense that it should still be possible, for example, to conduct research on live tests on commercially sensitive materials. It should also remain manageable for researchers and scholars to do all these things, because the demands become higher and higher. In the first place, having done the empirical work and having written it up on its own was already incredibly demanding. So I guess it's about finding that balance between the various things we do and how we sort of support and generate accessibility more generally. And there's obviously also a slight risk with open access, in the sense that research data and instruments can be taken out of context, can be then used in inappropriate manners as well. So there are some sort of ifs to it as well. But as I said, I think Dylan can probably say a lot more about, for example, steps we can take in research transparency.
Yeah, thank you, Tineke. Those are really important points. And Language Testing Journal has been taking steps over the past few years, since about 2019, to encourage authors to engage in open science practices. So within those different practices, we have open data, which is the sharing of the actual results from a research study that other people can go back and analyze and look at. And this is very important because we've seen studies from psychology that show that whenever there's a data set, even if many different teams that are well experienced in data analysis look at that same data set, they can often arrive at different conclusions. To the extent that in a study in psychology recently published, 100 different teams looked at this data set. I think it was 100, and only 50% of them found the same significant results, and another large percent of them didn't find the same results. So having open data allows other people to inspect those results. And as Tineke said, it's a question of research validity in that sense. Open materials is another option. Language Testing awards badges for both open data and open materials. And so these materials can be shared for replication studies. In my Viewpoint piece, I looked at the range of studies published in language testing over time, and replications have always been encouraged, even as early as 1994. But only 6 have taken place in the field, have been published in language testing. So there is a need for this through open materials. Other things, registered reports, of course, which allow the methodology to be inspected prior to the study being conducted. And this is something that's currently being encouraged in language testing since last year. Also, pre-registrations, which are another way to publish the methodology in an open repository ahead of time, so that those findings are confirmatory. And the researcher has to state their hypotheses, their methods ahead of time, their analytical methods before they conduct the analysis, to avoid certain types of confirmation bias that result in the research. And then also preprints and postprints, but that's a whole other discussion that can take place. But those are some of the ways that researchers can engage in sort of open research, transparent practices nowadays.
What topics do you think will dominate the field of language testing 10 years from now? In your opinion, what issues or problems will the researchers be grappling with during the 50th anniversary of language testing?
That's, of course, a very challenging question to answer. But on the one hand, I think in 10 years' time, we won't have radically broken with our current practices. I think there's some things that are constant in language testing. And so, for example, the basic concepts will remain central. So I'm talking about validity, ethics, assessment, competence or literacy, whatever label we use. So those key questions of what it is we're testing, how are we testing, why are we testing, I think they will remain there. I guess one particular challenge we might need to deal with in the future is about the relevance of language testing in a world where language can be auto-generated, for example. So writing is produced for us, speech, think about deep fakes and so on. And with that, I don't want to suggest this is the end of language testing, but I think the field probably will focus on or have debates around identifying where or how it is necessary and useful to test language ability. So I think that might be one of those issues we will grapple with in 10 years' time.
Yes, I found this quite a difficult question to think about because it made me look backwards to see how every 10 years or so, we've moved on or not moved on in our sort of enterprise of language testing and assessment. I think one of the things that really intrigues me going forward over the next 10 years, and I'll be interested to see where we've got to in 10 years' time, is how we will succeed in combining automatic evaluation with human evaluation. My PhD supervisor, Alistair Pollitt, in about 1990-91, made a very helpful sort of metaphorical analogy from language assessment to the world of figure skating and a number of other sports, and talked about the difference between counting and judging. There are different approaches to assessment, to testing, to competition. You can count certain things and you can judge certain things. And it seems to me that much of what technology is able to do for us in terms of automatic evaluation of writing or speaking is to do with counting things. But then equally, there are things that are better perhaps judged. And the question for me is, can human raters count things as well as machine evaluation? And can machine evaluation judge things as well as human raters? And the likely answer from my perspective is probably not. Each of those can do things really, really well, but the other thing they may not be able to do quite so well, and perhaps are not. It's not efficient for them to do that. So how can you bring the two together? Duolingo would call it human in the loop, I think, but I'm not sure that's a particularly good metaphor either. How can you bring those two together to get a rich evaluation of performance or whatever it is you want to measure? And I'll be very interested to see where we've moved on to in 10 years' time in that counting and judging collaboratively between automatic rating systems and human rater systems.
I'll go. I want to follow up on what both of you said. So interesting about what will we be doing. In some sense, I think we'll be doing the same thing we've been doing. It's like trying to establish a scale, a meaningful scale. And these judgments and counting issues are scale problems, right? It's like, how do we differentiate a gold and a silver and a bronze? And in those levels, there are classic scale problems that have to do with judgment, which was so great, that part in Spolsky's book. I agree. That's just wonderful. I always think it comes down to what we value. Our values are changing somewhat and are so influenced by the opportunities that technology provide. I think that balance, I agree, will be interesting to see what happens, but I think that it's all very difficult for us to make predictions on how it's going to turn out.
Yeah, I'll just echo that this question is really, really tough given my quite limited perspective as sort of just a recent, or what I feel is a recent graduate student in the field. But I'll echo what Tineke said. If you look back through language testing journals, the past editorials and special issues that marked sort of these occasions, these anniversaries in language testing, 10 years, 20 years, 25 years, all of the editors and authors in those different issues talked about the construct. What is the construct that we're tapping into? This is sort of the perennial main focus of language testing over time. And I think that in 10 years for our 50th anniversary, we're still going to be grappling with the same things. And this has been an undercurrent of our conversation today. We've talked about the constructs underlying multilingual assessment. What does it mean for a language to be seen as fluid rather than something static? Within the language itself, considering varieties and also between languages. What does it mean when we consider multimodal constructs? Language is a more communicative act rather than just a verbal act, broadening those constructs, understanding those constructs more as they relate to different contexts as well. And so I think that's still going to be our main focus in 10 years, that we'll still be writing about this, still trying to grapple with it. And who knows what we'll find. I mean, in terms of technology, I think this will definitely still be a topic, of course, but how technology grapples with these constructs or doesn't could definitely be a question that's still on the table.
I would like to thank everyone for taking time to participate in this interview. I look forward to welcoming our viewers in the next issue of Language Testing Bytes. And